take you back 5 years to a cold winter day in Melbourne, and it was June in Melbourne, so it was cold. Martin, my husband, and I were at a folk dancing workshop. I'm actually going to take a wild stab at this, and I'm going to guess that not many of you have been to an all-day folk dancing workshop. Yep. This, by the way, is not my folk dancing outfit. Well, basically, folk dancing involves complex, intense brain activity. You're constantly learning new steps and new sequences and new patterns, and you've got to memorise them all. Very complex sequences. We'd started at 9, and at 10:30, Martin just fairly casually said to me, "I'm so cold that I'm stuttering." I didn't actually take much notice, it was cold, and I didn't hear his stutter, so I thought, oh well, that's what it is. We continued dancing. We'd been learning new partner dances, complex new partner dances, and I imagine that any one of you who's ever done any partner dances knows that you know when your partner is not dancing well because your feet are getting stepped on. Well, Martin was dancing perfectly well and no feet were getting stepped on. We broke for lunch, and about 2 o'clock, Martin decided he really wanted to get back to dancing, so he went off to talk to the organisers and tell them, enough. And he came back looking slightly puzzled and told me that he'd been having trouble finding words. He actually sounded normal. He was speaking normally, but what was happening was that instead of the words just being there, he was actually having to look for them. And he had no other neurological signs at all. And a lot of friends have actually said to me that at that point they wouldn't have taken much notice. They would have just thought he was tired, he'd been dancing all morning. It was just a hiccup. Half of me really, really wanted to think that, but the other half of me was a psychologist. And I knew that if you were having trouble finding words, something was going on in your brain, and specifically something was going on in Broca's area, which is the area of the brain that's concerned with expressive speech. And so we got an ambulance, took Martin to hospital. At the hospital, the registrar agreed with me that there were no neurological signs that he could see either. And the only thing was that Martin just said he had trouble finding words. A scan didn't show up anything. Whatever it was too small. They decided they would just admit him. They thought it was a very small stroke. They'd keep him overnight for observation, and I would come and pick him up the next morning, take him home. I rang every 2 hours through the night and he was stable. There was no deterioration. So in the morning, just before I was setting out to pick him up, I just rang to let them know, and the nurse for the first time said, "There's been a deterioration." She wouldn't tell me what the deterioration was, so my daughter and I had to drive for an hour, really not knowing what we'd find. What we found when we got there was fairly catastrophic. Martin had had a major bleed in the left hemisphere of his brain. And so Martin had gone from one day being a bright, active, healthy 59-year-old man with no medical history of anything like strokes to someone who not only couldn't speak a word, he couldn't make a sound, not a single sound. He also couldn't write a word. He couldn't locate the word in his brain in order to print it onto paper. He couldn't communicate except through gestures. He couldn't count past 5. This was a brilliant computer analyst. And he was paralysed down his right side. The doctors were very pessimistic about his prognosis. They said he'd recover some abilities, but they were doubtful about a good recovery, and there was no talk of even getting anywhere near back to normal. I had spent all that next night researching. I knew that there was lots of research coming out on brain plasticity, and I knew that a lot of it wouldn't have trickled down yet. It takes a lot of time for things to trickle down to hospitals. I wanted to find and implement everything that I could, and I just thought, even if I can make a small difference with every intervention, maybe they'll all add up to a big difference in recovery. And one of the studies I found that night was from some researchers in Finland. They studied a particular post-stroke intervention, and when they tested the stroke patients 2 months after that intervention, there was a 60% improvement in verbal memory, compared to the two control groups, which only had an 18% improvement and a 29% improvement. So this particular intervention produced triple and double the benefits of the two control groups, which is a lot. It also gave a 17% increase in focused attention, which is crucial for rehabilitation. And as well as that, the group that had the intervention were less depressed and had fewer confused moods. Needless to say, that intervention wasn't being applied at the hospital, excellent as the hospital was, and no one was telling me about the intervention because no one had read that particular study. Was it a complex intervention? Was it dangerous? Had it not yet been passed by the Drug Administration authorities? Or did it have disturbing side effects? No, didn't have any of those. Can you have a guess at what it might have been? It was incredibly simple, and it was incredibly easy to apply. It was just music, listening to music of any genre. And that gave triple and double the benefits of the two control groups. All of the three groups, by the way, had standard rehab. Another intervention that I applied was one that I in particular knew about because I'd been working with it for 40 years as a clinical psychologist, and that was hypnosis. Hypnosis is absolutely the most underused tool that we have. It's at the cutting edge of the brain and the body and the mind. And it's one of those things I'm still amazed by it after 40 years. It gives all the emotional and cognitive benefits that you get with meditation, and it gives more besides. And it's also easier for an ill person to use. It promotes calmness, improves motivation, concentration, mood, all of those things. But it's also really ideal for brain training through imagery. The brain essentially works on a use it or lose it principle. The brain needs adequate stimulation, and if it doesn't get that particular area of the brain tends to lose its function. So you have to stimulate the brain to keep it functioning. Now, when you have a stroke, of course, the part of the brain that's affected by the stroke is not being stimulated, and it becomes a kind of circuit that gets worse and worse. The less it's stimulated, the less it's likely to be stimulated. Now, when we imagine performing an action, and when we actually physically perform the action, the same area of the brain is stimulated and becomes active. So that when you visualise, when you imagine playing tennis, for example, the same area in your brain lights up as does when you actually pick up a tennis racket. And as I said before, in a stroke, you really want to stimulate the area of the brain that's been affected by the stroke. You want to activate those particular neurons because of the use it or lose it principle. Well, visualisation, as I said, stimulates the brain, and hypnosis is really the Ferrari of visualisation. So it was a really great way to stimulate Martin's brain in various ways. And there are some really interesting studies coming out about visualisation and the brain. One study focused on improving the strength of your little finger, and if you flex your little finger, that improves the strength. So in this particular study, one group imagined flexing their fingers. They didn't actually move their fingers, and the other group actually physically flexed their fingers. Now, when they were tested after 12 weeks of daily flexing and imagining flexing, the group that had actually flexed their fingers had an improved finger strength of 53%. And the group that hadn't moved their fingers but had simply imagined flexing their fingers had improved their finger strength by 35%, nearly as much. The control group that hadn't imagined and hadn't moved their fingers had no improvement in strength. So that's fairly impressive. And another study looked at the effect on the brain of practicing 5-finger piano exercises. And when you do those 5-finger piano exercises, a particular part of your brain gets bigger as you just keep practicing. One group practiced daily for 5 weeks, and the other group just did mental practice, didn't touch the piano but imagined touching the piano. The two groups had nearly the same degree of change in the size of the area of the brain. And again, that's really quite astonishing stuff to take in. Now, I'd worked in hospitals for decades, and I've also experienced them from the other side of the desk as a cancer patient, but I had never experienced hospitals as a carer or a patient advocate, and it was fairly jaw-dropping, eye-opening, all of those kind of epithets. There's a joke that I think pretty much sums it up. A surgeon, a civil engineer, and a hospital administrator are arguing about what's the oldest profession in the world. And the surgeon says, well, in the Bible, it says God created Eve from a rib taken out of Adam. Clearly this required surgery, so obviously mine is the oldest profession. Civil engineer interrupts and says, but even earlier in the book of Genesis, it says God created order from chaos. That was the first and certainly the most spectacular feat of civil engineering. Therefore, fair doctor, you're wrong. Mine is the oldest profession in the world. And the hospital administrator leans back in his chair with a very superior smile and says, but gentlemen, who do you think created the chaos? And I think that pretty much sums it up. And we know from studies that if you want to maximise stress, you want 3 components to the stressful experience. You want no control over the stress, you want no predictability over the stress, and you want a context in which there's real danger. And the job of carer just ticks all 3 boxes and a whole lot more besides. So it was a really steep learning curve for me, and it was also one of the things that I wrote about in my memoir. But back to Martin's progress. At 2 weeks post-stroke, Martin is still unable to say a single word, not one word, and he can't write either. Not because he can't physically grip the pencil, but because he can't find the words in his brain to put onto the paper. So communicating was obviously a challenge. And it was also pretty frightening. At 3 weeks, Martin could say a handful of words. That was his entire vocabulary. He couldn't say more than 1 word at a time. He couldn't put together words. And with his left hand, he's right-handed, but his right hand was paralysed. With his left hand, he could write a very small handful of words, very laboriously. At 4 weeks, he could put a few words into a phrase, and he could have a very limited conversation, no more than 5 minutes. Tiny, tiny vocabulary. And at 4 weeks, he could walk well, but his right arm, was still completely paralysed. And that was when I thought about using the mirror box. The mirror box was first devised by a brilliant neuroscientist, Dr Ramachandran. And essentially, it's a device that uses mirrors to trick your brain. What you do is you pick something up with your good left hand, for example, and you look in the mirror as you're doing it, and it looks as if it's your paralysed right hand that is actually moving. So it fools the brain, and that's the theory behind it. And what ideally you do before using the mirror box is you do lots of motor imaging, practicing in your mind, and then you use the mirror box. And I ordered a mirror box from Adelaide. It arrived, I took it into the physio department, they were quite excited, and the results were quite extraordinary. By the next day, Martin was feeling as if his fingers were about to move, and by 2 days they were actually starting to move, and they then made recovery after recovery after recovery. Every day, more and more things were able to be done with his fingers, and he's now completely recovered. And the other thing that happened at around 4 weeks was Martin could speak well enough to actually tell me what had happened on the morning of the deterioration. What had actually happened was he'd been admitted that afternoon with that very small, whatever it was, very small stroke, probably very small clot, they thought. very, very minor effect. And he'd been admitted that afternoon. He'd had a hospital meal that evening, food he was unused to, he was constipated, and the next morning he was straining on the toilet early in the morning, and that's when he had the bleed. And of course he then couldn't speak, he couldn't tell anyone what had happened. Now, I looked up the research on straining on the toilet and stroke, and I found a Netherlands study on straining on the toilet, a wonderful conjunction of country and research topic. And it basically said that straining raises the blood pressure in the brain, and it can dislodge clots or burst fragile blood vessels under the strain of that increased pressure. And that's exactly what happened to Martin. A very small blockage in his brain of the day before became a very large bleed, causing massive damage the next morning. And you can't help but wonder what would have happened if someone had simply said to him, don't strain on the toilet, or given out stool softeners. And that's advice I always give to anyone in a similar situation. At nearly 7 weeks post-stroke, Martin was doing really well. He's speaking, he's writing, he's using his right hand, and then he suddenly ran a fever for a day. Blood tests were taken, and it was discovered that a very nasty and deadly bug was in his bloodstream. It's a bug that causes endocarditis, infection of the heart, and it's quite deadly. So there were now two mysteries: what caused Martin's stroke, and how on earth had he picked up this bug? It wasn't a hospital bug, and it's not usually found in your bloodstream. No one was taking history far back enough to understand it, and each of the specialists, excellent as they were, had a very narrow focus. So it was up to us to put all those pieces together, and what we worked out was that 3 months before the stroke, Martin had had a benign bread and butter prostate procedure. 3 days after the procedure, he'd run a temperature for a day. His surgeon wasn't worried. But it turned out that was when the bug got in. And the bug went to his heart, where it stayed silently, as it does for a number of days. 3 months is, quite standard. And then a little bit of the little bit of the clot broke off, went to Martin's brain, and that caused a stroke. So in a quite extraordinary way, Martin's stroke actually saved his life, because that was what led to discovering this infection in his heart, which in fact would have killed him if it was undiscovered. The roller coaster continued with epilepsy from the scar tissue, mitral valve damage from the heart infection, open heart surgery. It was quite a ride. But today, Martin is able to do everything that he could do before the stroke. The only thing he can't do is play the piano. But he couldn't play the piano before the stroke, so that's okay. And astonishingly, when you look at Martin's MRI today, there is a big black ink blot, 3 by 3 by 3 centimetres, where Broca's area, the area of expressive speech, used to be. It's not there anymore, it's been wiped out, and yet Martin is speaking perfectly well. So it's an extraordinary tribute to brain plasticity. His doctors have been astounded by his recovery. In the excellent rehab hospital he was in, his recovery was regarded as amazing. It was very much out of the ordinary. They still have him as the poster boy of recovery. And I should add, by the way, that with the mirror box, after I brought it in, someone found a mirror box in the back room of the physio department that no one was using, and maybe not using still. Now, Martin and I are both positive that without all of the interventions that I put in place, his story would be really different. And I was terribly lucky in that I had the training to understand the research and how to apply it, and not everyone has got that training. One of the things you can do, if you don't, is hire a postgrad neuropsych student to look up the latest research and collate it, and you can then take those papers to the physician. If you want to use hypnosis, just find a psychologist or a doctor who practices it. If the person who's in hospital is depressed, for example, or the ill person, maybe not in hospital, if they're depressed, ask about antidepressants, because quite apart from the improvement in mood, one of the things we're finding is that some antidepressants promote neurogenesis, the growth of new brain cells, which is absolutely what we want. So there are things that you can do, and unfortunately, it's you who have to do them. That's the really sad thing about the system. The doctors are good, the system essentially is good. It's just that it's incredibly overloaded. Everyone is too busy. And I wrote about all that in my memoir, The Twelfth Raven, and a lot of people have asked Martin whether he minds being written about, and in fact he doesn't. He's actually pleased, because we've both been incredibly lucky, and if telling this story can help just one person, then we feel even luckier. And that was one of the reasons that I wrote The Twelfth Raven, and it's essentially the book that I longed for when I was going through the journey, a guidebook to the journey. And also I wanted to open up the inner life of the carer. And I think so many of us are going to be at some point in our lives carers or patients, and it's just so important to talk about it. So thank you very much.
By the time we're 60, more than 90% of us will have known someone close to us who has suffered from some sort of a neurological disorder.
You all know you're not going to live forever. There's only one way into this life and one way out.
I cannot prove to you anymore that anything is possible.
Talk about the marvelous thing that we now understand about our brains.
It gets so much better.